Alrighty, John beat me onto the screen this time. Welcome everyone to today's last session for the NNP Symposium. Thank you very much for joining us and coming back if you joined us for a session earlier in the day. Let's see. So as a reminder, if you have any questions, we will be doing a Q&A at the end. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a button that says Q&A. You can click on there and type in any questions you have. You can send them in at any point, but we will be waiting until the end of the presentation to answer them. So this hour, of course, we are here with John Kraljevich, who I'm sure is a familiar name to most of you, a very decorated member of the numismatic community, contributor to the Red Book with many other accolades. So today he's going to be talking to us about some very important numismatic books that have lasted in their importance in the industry. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John, and I will be back at the end when it is time for the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Liana. Thank you to the Newman Numismatic Portal for having me and hosting this. And thanks to you all out there who are watching. I have no idea who's tuned in. I have no idea how many of you there are. All I can see on my screen, unfortunately, is my face and the PowerPoint presentation. So also, I can't see your questions. So like Liana said, we will handle all of those at the end. So the title here today, Why 5 Great Numismatic Books Have Stood the Test of Time, Evidence versus Speculation. So this talk is about numismatic literature, of course, because as you can see behind me, numismatic literature is sort of the straw that stirs the drink around here. But this is also a talk about the historical method. It's a talk about research. It's a talk about history and sourcing and writing. I've spent most of my time over the last 20 years. I mean, sure, I buy and sell things and, do some other things in numismatics and not, but I spend most of my time writing and researching, primarily auction catalogs and some other things. My background is in history. I don't have a PhD. I don't have anything like that. I just have a measly old bachelor's from a school in Virginia. But the historical method and proper historical methodology has always been very, very important to me, because these books you see behind me, most of them are written by dead people. And after we're all dead and gone, and as Daniel Eccleston once said to Thomas Jefferson, when we're all moldering in the dust, these books are left behind. So we have an opportunity and really we have a responsibility to get the research right, to do it right the first time. So this is about 5 books and some more than 5 books where they really managed to get it right because of good methodology. So let's, how do I forward this? There we go. All right. So what is evidence? Let's start with the historical method. What is historical evidence? It's really 2 things, primary sources and secondary sources. And these words are stolen from a very good page on the website of the University of Washington Library about the historical method and about historical evidence. Primary sources are kind of what researchers go for. That's why we go to archives. That's why we flip through dusty manuscripts. That's why we do the research that we do, is trying to find that primary source that ultimately is the root of everything else. So primary sources can be documents. They can be artifacts. Coins are a primary source, of course. But as they say here, they are created by a witness or a participant in an event to be firsthand testimony, or they're evidence created during the time period that you're studying. And in a larger sense, that could be lots of different stuff. That could be legal documents. That could be printed laws. That can be photographs or diaries or letters. Anything that sort of directly talks about the object or era or personality that you're discussing. And then secondary sources are kind of everything that comes after that. Most of the books behind me here are secondary sources. This talk is a secondary source. A good secondary source will incorporate a lot of primary sources and let you know where to find primary sources. But most books are not in and of themselves primary sources unless it's like an autobiography, a memoir, a government document printed at the time in question, this sort of thing. Now, of course, the things that we're all interested in and collect, coins and paper money, those are a really valuable primary source because they weren't made to be self-consciously historical documents like, say, a book about history was. But there's something that sheds light on a historical moment in a really unique and important way. And any other kind of material culture could do that as well. All right, so numismatists in particular, what kind of evidence do we use? What are our primary sources? Well, coins, of course. Coins are very important, or paper money or tokens or medals or whatever other kind of numismatic object. Those are all primary sources for us. Archaeology is a great primary source because like this Virginia halfpenny, scruffy and ugly as it is in this guy's hand, that's one thing. It tells us that, George III was the king in 1773 and that Virginia was a colony in 1773 and, that sort of thing. But the fact that this particular one was dug up in a house in Baltimore tells us more than that. It tells us that, Virginia halfpenny circulated Maryland, and maybe if we find out the strata and find out that it was deposited in 1805, that tells us they were still circulating then, et cetera, et cetera. So archaeology can be a really important primary source, even on top of the primary source objects that it discovers. Of course, most researchers depend most heavily on texts, laws, newspapers, manuscripts, any kind of printed or written material. But ultimately, the best primary source is being able to take all this stuff and put it in its proper context. So good primary sources aren't just narrow, they're also broad. So a good numismatic researcher, a good historical researcher will not just be able to talk about that Virginia halfpenny or the place it was dug up, but they'll also have a really broad array of knowledge that helps to interpret that. And so lots of other primary sources, knowing about, Robert Carter Nicholas and his service as the Treasurer of Virginia, that those sorts of kinds of information can help enlighten here. Okay, so what's the opposite of evidence? The opposite of evidence is speculation. All of these little clips came from one numismatic article. I was flipping through some old journals the other day, and this one came up, and it was a highly speculative article. These are all from one article. It can be assumed, conjecture, contemplated, possible, likely, inferred. This is all speculation. So anytime you see these kinds of words, we're talking about guesswork. We're not talking about evidence. So let's talk about what speculation is and it isn't. So it's analysis is one thing. Talking about primary sources and using that context and using your broad base of knowledge is analysis, right? Now, that's different from guessing. That's different from what ifs. So when you're building a case, what you're really trying to do is distill truth from the available information, not invent a narrative. You're trying to find the data and then see the story that the data tells you. And of course, in many cases, in any kind of history, whether you're talking about the history of last week or the history of ancient Rome, you're not going to get a complete story. And part of a historian's responsibility, whether you're a numismatic historian or not, is being honest about what's not there and what the data doesn't tell you. So when you gather all your data, and you go to all the libraries and you go and look at all the documents and you do all the Googling and you look through all the collections and all the, museum galleries and whatnot, and you get all of your original sources, and then you distill those sources down to see what they say, you're going to end up with a lot of stuff they don't say. And that's okay. What a historian doesn't do is come up with an idea and then try to find the data to support it. Now, that's a polemic. That's okay. There's room for that. It's just not historical research. Historical research is, I want to find out everything I can possibly find out about, the continental dollar. You knew that would come up. And then I'm going to go find all of the data, all the things that people said at the time, all of the coins, all the things that were printed in the era, all of the secondary sources about it. And from all that information, I'm going to sort through it and rifle through it and put it in order and try to figure out what it tells me, rather than coming up to an endpoint and then finding the data that supports the endpoint and ignoring the stuff that doesn't. And part of what is important is discerning the bias of every source. Every source has a bias. There is no such thing as an unbiased source. And then finding out the truth value of those sources. So no matter what the source is, whether it's a law or a letter, you have to come into it with a healthy skepticism about just how much value you can derive from it in terms of historical truth. Like this newspaper clipping was used in a different journal article some years ago, and it was sort of the linchpin of a whole argument. But if you look through it, and this is from 1770s, 1780s, time of the American Revolution, it talks all about these copper half dollars and quarters and eights that were struck in the Americas and circulated widely and were the same size as silver coins. Now, that's all nonsense. None of that happened, which means that for this particular document, if you look at a document and let's say it's got, 4 or 5 items that it's suggesting, and you know that 2 or 3 of those are total BS, you have to call into question the whole document. And this is something that historians do all the time, is look at a document and say, this document tells me 10 things. I know 8 of them are completely made up and untrue and unsupportable with any other evidence. Maybe those other 2 things that I can't find any evidence on one way or the other, maybe they're not exactly right either. So what else do we do with research versus speculation? We place facts in their proper context. And this is where sort of being a good historian and not being a good numismatist comes into play. Coins and metals and paper money and all that, they don't exist in a vacuum. All of these objects served a function before they were our toys and our collectibles. And you have to understand the people that they served, the cultures that they served, the folks that were making them, the folks that were spending them, the folks that were imitating them. And it's a really a broad continuum of knowledge that a good numismatic researcher is expected to have in terms of understanding not just the sources and what they say and what they don't say, but also understanding the broader sort of zeitgeist or atmosphere or culture or texture of the world at the time and the people that were involved. So when I'm writing a piece and I'm doing all the research and I've gathered all my evidence, I'm trying to see what the evidence tells me, whether it's an auction catalog description or a journal article or anything, I try to break it. With computer programmers, they call this a beta test. You design a program and then you give it to somebody else and say, all right, find a way to mess this up. And it's kind of the same thing with a historical argument, is that you build your case based on data, and then maybe you hand it to somebody else, or you step back and, go get yourself a snack and come back. And then you try to find the holes in it. And you try to break it. You question every piece of data. You question every primary source. Is this primary source accurate? Is it truthful? Is there something to support it? Am I looking at all of the various kinds of biases correctly? Am I looking at all of the various kinds of context correctly? What am I missing? What could someone look at here and say, I don't think that's right. I don't think that's what that evidence says. And when you find those holes, historians, we all have egos, obviously, especially anybody who writes. You can't come to this with an ego. You have to look for your holes. And the best of us acknowledge them, which is hard, especially if you get kind of close to your subject matter, and don't explain them away, but be forthcoming about what the data doesn't say. And if you're making an argument based upon the data, with those holes, be honest about, what's your argument, what part is supported and what part maybe isn't. And of course, the last important piece of the difference between analysis and guessing, don't make stuff up. And I bring up the picture here of Walter Breen's encyclopedia just because Breen was a great researcher. He really was. And he was one of the first to really dive into primary source work. He went and spent a lot of time in the National Archives. He dug out stuff that no one else had ever seen. I did some work in the National Archives, 20 years ago now, back when I was in college, and I still found some of Breen's pencil notes on the margins of letters from Salmon P. Chase. He was there before anybody else was. But unfortunately, for better or for worse, when he came up with a story and there was something that didn't quite make sense, he took a leap. Sometimes it came to him in a dream. Sometimes he just, decided that A plus B equals zebra. And he came up with a narrative when no narrative was really suggested by the raw facts. So we all like to tell stories. Stories are great, but bridging those factual gaps by making stuff up, not great historical method. All right, so let's talk about 5 books. And there are other books we could have talked about, of course. But we'll start with these 5. Eckfeld and Dubois' Manual of Gold and Silver of All Nations, Dr. Riddell's monograph of the Silver Dollar, Sylvester Crosby's Early Coins of America, which is always within arm's reach when I'm doing my work. Where's my copy of Crosby? I'm sure it's here somewhere. I have a lot of books around. Carruthers' Fractional Money, one of my all-time favorites, and then Kenneth Scott's Counterfeiting in Colonial America, and the other books related to it. So let's start with Eckfeld and Dubois, I think it's Dubois. Manual of Gold and Silver Coins of All Nations, struck within the past century, so since 1742, and the title continues, showing their history and legal basis and their actual weight, fineness, and value chiefly from original and recent assays, which with which are incorporated treatises on bullion and plate, counterfeit coins, specific gravity, this is all still the title, of precious metals, etc., with recent statistics of the production and coinage of gold and silver in the world and sundry useful tables. That's a long title, but that's the whole title. And the neat thing about this book is that's what it delivers. Everything that's suggested in the title is exactly what's in the book. Book is from 1842. It's one of the very earliest numismatic texts, one of the very earliest coin texts in the United States. Of course, you know, there's lots of other old stuff in other places. And there's our gentleman down there, a picture of I guess a watercolor of Jacob Rees-Eckfeldt, and then his cohort at the Mint, Mr. Dubois, there in a later photograph. So the neat thing about this book is that it's so early that for most authors, the 1840s at the US Mint is something that we can only look at as history. But in this book, the 1840s at the US Mint was the present. And nothing makes for a better historical document than a firsthand account. Like, for instance, on the left here, we have a firsthand account about the Bechtler coinage, which was still being made then. And, you know, he takes information directly from Bechtler. He's seen these folks who were assayers. They've seen the Bechtler coinage come in deposits at the Mint. And there on the right is an 1804 dollar. And this is the first time that most numismatists ever saw one of these and knew it existed. So pictures are also a very important primary source and a very important firsthand account. Now, of course, this isn't a proper photograph. This is basically an engraving made from Saxton's machine, which copied over coins and turned them into this kind of plate. I forget the exact term because it's late in the day. But anyway, so this is the first place an 1804 dollar gets illustrated. That's a great primary reference. And if you're doing a history of the 1804 dollar, you got to look at this thing. There it is. Now, as you go through the Eckfeldt and Dubois book, you realize these guys are scientists. So there's a precision here. That's why there's charts. That's why there's testimony about the kinds of coins that come in on deposit. And when they did a second edition in 1850, you have even more information about territorial gold coins they saw, foreign coins they saw, eyewitness firsthand testimony. I saw this coin. This is what it was. This is what it wasn't. All of this, which makes this book not only dependent on primary sources, like their discussion of information that came directly from Bechtler, but it's a primary source in and of itself. Now, nearly contemporary, 1845, you have the assayer of the New Orleans Mints writing a book, which wasn't quite the same as the Eckfeldt-Dubois book, but was sort of along the same lines. The monograph of the silver dollar, Good and Bad, illustrated with facsimile figures of 425 varieties of dollars and 87 varieties of half dollars, including the genuine, the low standard, and the counterfeit, giving their weight, quality, and exact value, and enabling the inexperienced to detect those which are spurious. And again, long title, but that's exactly what it does. It actually depicts, with this interesting sort of rubbing style, all of these counterfeits. So what does this tell us? First of all, he actually got his hands on all of these coins. So these are all kind of primary, first-person primary source documents when this scientist, this assayer, Dr. Riddell, is testing their fineness, is examining them in hand, is illustrating them. We have a first-person opinion on whether something is struck or cast. And the neat thing for someone who's interested in, say, foreign coins that circulated in early America is we know all of these were in New Orleans at a particular time. That makes this extremely valuable. And for people that collect this kind of stuff today, we can go back in this book that's now, what, 170 years old, and actually plate match coins in our collections to these illustrations. This is a great secondary source about these things, but it's also, again, a primary source because these illustrations are really a primary source document to talk about the history of what was in New Orleans at that time. So this book, as old as it is really still the standard reference on this material in many ways. Crosby. Crosby's probably my favorite book. Sylvester S. Crosby wrote The Early Coins of America and the Laws Governing Their Issue. It was first published serially. It was finally published between boards in 1875. You know, this book is going to be 150 years old soon. And I use it almost every day. And that's a testament not only to the breadth of Crosby's knowledge and the quality of his research, but also to his ability to depend upon sources only to the extent that they were dependable. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Like Montreville W. Dickinson covered a lot of the same territory 15 years earlier, 1858, 1859. Illustrated a lot of the same coins, started describing their varieties, but he also just wasn't that discerning. So he put a lot of stuff in there that just wasn't true later on. And while Crosby didn't get everything right, and not everything in Crosby is 100% accurate, he did miss the mark on some things. For his era, he was incredibly discerning. And so that means that most of this book is still just as useful as when it was published. Now, a few neat things about Crosby. It's really the first volume in American numismatics that's based on numismatic research. Stuff that came before that was either things published by mint officials, Snowden, Eckfeld Dubois, things along those lines, lists like the Mickley book, things about literature, things like Dickinson that were, observational and sort of, collected a bunch of information but didn't do any real research. Crosby knew a lot, but what he didn't know, he went looking for, and then he let the primary sources that he found really speak for themselves. And he put a lot of those primary sources in the book. And he really invented numismatic research in a way by combining that primary source research, documentary research, eyewitness accounts, things like that, with interesting ways to study and classify numismatic specimens, which enabled him to sort of dovetail different kinds of primary sources into research, into a highly dependable secondary source that not only serves as a good secondary source, but lets us find what he was working from. So the fact that it's still the standard reference, I mean, we should all be so lucky that anything we write is still going to be used 150 years from now. It's really spectacular. So one thing that makes Crosby so special is not only did he do a survey of secondary sources, he then went back and looked at the sources that they depended on to examine what we talked about earlier, the sort of truth value to them, if they were accurate, if they were missing anything. Like on this particular citation, he's talking about circulating coins in Maryland, and he cites a book called The Laws of Maryland, which is just a collection of all sorts of legal documents. And this collection publishes this book this law from the 1660s. And then when he went back and looked for that actual law in the archives, he didn't find it. So he knew that by publishing this secondary source about this law, that with that caveat put in there, it could be wrong, there could be something left out, it could be edited, and he wanted to put that in there just as a warning that this might not be complete, that this might not be entirely accurate. And he went looking for that primary source to see what else the primary source could tell him, and found that it couldn't tell him anything else. What else did Crosby do? So Crosby not only went to the primary sources, he reproduced them. So from left to right, let's look here. There's a letter that he got from Charles Bushnell, who'd been doing this for decades already by the 1870s, a letter that was written to Bushnell from 1855 that is a first-person account. There's another first-person account from a different character at the bottom of the page, but a first-person account about New Jersey mints that at that point was only 60 years old, and not that long ago. So that's as close as we can get today in 2021 to a real eyewitness account of these things. And it would have been one thing if Crosby had read that letter and put in a few lines or put in a few facts from that letter and not said where he came from. But here he actually reproduces the whole thing, which is awesome, which is great. And there at the bottom, in court, it would be hearsay because it's one person saying what another person said. But Bushnell actually talks about another little piece that he got, another little first-person primary source testimony. Now, Walter Breen talked about Mr. Hatfield and decided that Mr. Hatfield, who claimed to have made dies and struck New Jersey coppers, must have been a counterfeiter, and that since the most well-known counterfeit of New Jersey coppers is the serpent head, that Mr. Hatfield must be responsible for the serpent head. That's not what the data says. The data, and the only thing that we know about Hatfield is from this thing from Crosby. All that we know is that there was a Mr. Hatfield who made New Jersey coppers in a barn and made dies for them. That could have been one of the mints. That could have been some other counterfeit. It could have been lots of things. So Breen, unfortunately, took that primary source, which is very valuable, but also limited, and took a leap with speculation that puts us into something that probably isn't defensible and honestly probably isn't even accurate. So there in the middle, another letter from Dr. Amy Brown of Boston talking about the fantasy 1650 pine tree shillings and their diminutions. And he basically just wrote a letter in 1868 talking about stuff that had happened 18, 20 years earlier. And Crosby published the whole letter. And then in the subsequent pages, Crosby kind of went through and said, this is probably accurate. This probably isn't. But instead of just taking his own opinions, he actually reproduced this primary source. And there on the right-hand side, you actually see a reproduction of one of the original pages from the minutes of the Massachusetts Bay Colony's General Court with the original illustrations of what they intended pine tree shillings to look like. That's awesome. And God forbid a document like this gets lost or something like that. We have this in all of our libraries because of Crosby's foresight. All right, so another great book. Now, Crosby was a watchmaker. He wasn't a scientist like Eckfeld Dubois. He wasn't a scientist like Riddell. The fact that he was able to do such great historical work is a real testament to his genius. Now, Dr. Neil Carruthers was a college professor. He was an economist. He was a historian, Princeton educated, taught at Lehigh for many, many years. And this was based on his PhD thesis and was published as a separate book for the first time in 1930. Most of us probably either have the 1967 reprint or a 1990s reprint that was done by Bowers and Renna. And there's Dr. Carruthers there on the right. I bet you've never seen him before. It took some effort to get that picture of him. And what Carruthers Fractional Money did, and it was about kind of the whole realm of coins and currency, really from pre-Confederation days all the way through the 20th century, is it took his broad base of knowledge with economics and historical stuff and politics, and he used that context to interpret numismatic history in a way that no very large, broad survey had ever done before. Gould did it for Maryland in particular. There are some other very sort of narrow studies from the 19th century that talk about money and put it in a historical and political context. But Carruthers did it for soup to nuts. And so instead of talking about coins as coins and currency and talking about it as a sort of collectible or you know, this sort of thing, he really put it in context of its time and used it as a way to not only inform us about the historical era and about the political attitudes of the time, but use the history and politics to teach us about the objects as well. And I found one sort of clip here that kind of symbolizes that and how he examined the truth value of sources. This is a mention, I believe, from Salmon P. Chase, if memory serves, about postage currency. And he wrote this thing about the Postmaster General, made an arrangement. And Carruthers went in and said, this source, this original primary source document, totally full of it. None of this happened. It's untrue. And so we have two valuable things here. We not only have the reproduction of a primary source, which is interesting, but we have good analysis that his other broad base of knowledge and his analysis shows that it's unsupported. And sometimes the most valuable thing you can do is shoot a hole through a primary source so nobody else gets hung up on it later. Another one of my favorite numismatic academics was Dr. Kenneth Scott, who spent a lot of his time at Queens College. He did a bunch of pioneering monographs with the ANS and with other local, regional, and statewide historical societies on counterfeiting, although he was a classicist by training. And all of this was sort of essentialized and boiled down into a single, mostly popular work called Counterfeiting in Colonial America. It's not footnoted. It's a little more breezy to read than some of his more academic texts, but it's based upon this very academic work he did before the publication of this book in 1957. And I bet you've never seen a picture of Dr. Scott either. So Scott was a professional historian. This is what he did for a living. And the neat thing about a book like this written by a historian is, holy crap, the footnotes are great. They're so valuable. And they reproduce citations of newspapers and of contemporary printed material, of court documents and legal proceedings and manuscripts and collections that, you know, if you wanted to go and research counterfeiting in your town, it would take a lifetime to figure out where all these things were. He did all the legwork and told you where to follow up so that you can double check him in the future. There on the top clip, it's mostly about newspapers, and 18th century newspapers. They publish a blurb and then another newspaper picks it up, and sometimes they twist it a little bit or put a bias in it, and it's kind of like whisper down the lane. And it's interesting that he actually found in this particular clip a description of counterfeits translated from English into German at the same time. So a German translation, probably straight from the English, but maybe the person writing in German knew something else about it. So you can get different perspectives on the same thing, which is kind of neat and valuable. And then there at the bottom, this guy actually went to these dusty old courthouses to go through these documents looking for evidence of cases against counterfeiters, and found out what they found. And if you wanted to rewrite this book, which might not be a bad idea, actually, there's probably a lot of stuff that could be added to it today, you could go back in those documents and find all of these other pages that Scott looked at, but didn't feel like were valuable enough to include in the book for brevity's reasons, or because he didn't know something about him that you might know. And you can go back and, without reinventing the wheel, go down the same path and find out what maybe Scott's biases were or what he left out. So good footnoting is very, very valuable when you're talking about good, well-founded, non-speculative numismatic research. So question is, are there still books like this being written today? Books that are done with a good, hardcore, bedrock kind of historical research that are using real primary sources and using the data not beyond their limitations, but using them within their limitations to tell a story? And absolutely. So Scott wrote in 1857 or 1957. I'm sorry. By then, of course, Eric Newman was already one of America's best researchers. The first edition of his book on early paper money of America came out in 1967. There have been several subsequent editions. And Newman's book is nice because it's really just the facts. It's not the kind of book, with the exceptions of some of the forward matter and some of the appendices. You're not going to curl up in bed and read Newman. But when you want facts, Newman's got them. He went into, again, primary sources, documents from state governments, documents from colonial governments, to find out about the paper money. He used his own observational research as a collector of this material, as an accumulator of this kind of information, to tell us more about what signers are known, things like this, which isn't always indicated by the original documents. What issues are actually known in a physical sense today, rather than just being authorized but are currently unknown. There's illustrations. It's really a just the facts kind of narrative. Now, is there room in the information ecosphere and the marketplace of ideas for a book that more tells the story of colonial paper money? Sure. But if you're going to tell the story in a narrative way, Newman's fact-based approach is going to be vital and basic to anyone who would actually go after that. One of my favorite books, again, written by a scientist, Dr. Mossman, still around, still loves this stuff, is an MD, he's a physician and a teacher and a writer of textbooks. So he gets the scientific method. And the historical method is really a lot like the scientific method. We gather data, we analyze the data, we put together a theory or a narrative, we try to find ways to blow holes in it. When we get new data, we change our mind or shift a little bit. That happens all the time. And Mossman really mastered that. And this book that was first published serially in the Colonial Newsletter, and then eventually as a standalone text by the A&S in 1993, he went back through primary documents that no one had ever really delved into, and used this sort of scientific analytic mind to combine that evidence with good mathematical and scientific and quantitative analysis to tell a story that just the documents of the coins alone don't tell. Like this, he transcribed a chart from the Virginia legislature from 1655 and used his broad contextual basis of knowledge to kind of suggest that certain coins weren't being overvalued, that coins were still full weight and had not been extensively diminished yet, this sort of thing. So Mossman's book, if you're starting a work of numismatic research, even if it has nothing to do with colonial coins, Mossman's book is a model for the approach that a good researcher will take. Lots of footnotes too. Now, I think one of the best researchers working today, and if he's watching, I'm sorry for embarrassing him, Neil Musante has written a few things. He continues to write in the Metal Collectors of America MCA journal. He's most recently written on Washington, but this was sort of his first full-length effort in numismatics, the medallic work of John Adams Bolin. And I think this is an absolute model for numismatic research. And if you look, all of the information you could ever want about these Bolin medals is in there. And when he exhaustively reviewed all of the primary documents about Bolin medals, he found inconsistencies because he'd seen everything. And if you haven't seen everything, sometimes it's hard to pull things out and say, this doesn't make as much sense, or other things I found have indicated that this probably isn't true. But since he was able to find all of these primary sources, both textual and the actual medals themselves, he was able to do things like he did down here in the notes, where he said, an 1868 AJN article, again, roughly contemporary, sort of a first-person primary source, states that none were issued, but then we know where one is, so I guess that means they were issued. And then he kind of gets through, when these things show up at auction, and you're able to develop a timeline, and the whole book's like this, and it's neat, it's elegant, it's fact-based, and it lets the data tell the story. And maybe the most impressive work of numismatic research during my lifetime has been the work of Roger Burdett, which has gone through several books. There's 3 volumes of the Renaissance of American coinage covering 1905 to 1921. He did another work on World War II era experimental and pattern pieces. And Roger is a just the facts guy. Again, he's a information technology guy, he's a computer guy, he's a scientist. He has this kind of approach where he lets the data speak for itself. And like in this text, he does a little bit of analysis, but the primary sources do such a good job of telling the story, he lets them tell the story. And sometimes the best thing as a historian or as a researcher is to get out of the way, is to not let your own idea of the narrative, your interpretations take away from the elegance of the primary sources. And so Roger not only lets the primary sources speak for themselves in a really great way, but you can see down at the bottom, he goes and finds all the primary sources. He goes to the archives. He tells you, if you want to go look at this letter, and if I've cited 2 paragraphs and you want to see the 2 or 3 paragraphs I didn't cite, you can go to this box on this shelf and you can see it yourself. And that's great, because so many numismatic writers will take a little piece or snippet that someone else like Roger finds and then reproduce it until a lot of the context is gone. Roger said, lots of people have written about St. Gaudens since 1907. My God, it's like it's the thrice told, twice told tale of numismatics. But he went back and looked at the documents himself and let those documents tell the story in a way that I don't think will ever be superseded. So we all know the famous quote, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. But the problem with that is Mark Twain never said that. So we all take this as sort of a kernel of inherited knowledge that Mark Twain said, never let the truth get in the way of a good story. And you have to speculate to tell a good story. You have to stretch things a little bit to string it all together in a narrative and a story that makes sense. But the problem with that is, first, it's not true. And second of all, if you dig into the primary sources about this most famous quote about primary sources, it's not even true. He never said it. And if you Google it and Google Mark Twain and this saying, or Google just this saying, the first 50 pages on Google all assert Mark Twain said it. He didn't. You'll never find a place where it's published in any of his letters or books or lectures. And keep in mind, this was the guy who was like the most famous guy in America for decades. People wrote down everything he said. You'll never find a place, of course, you can go research and try to prove me wrong if you want, where he actually said this. But according to the internet, he did. Page 1, page 10, page 30 of Google, they all said he said it. So I guess this might seem a little bit weird to tell a bunch of people brought together by an internet numismatic information clearinghouse, but don't trust the internet. There's a lot of information on there. And digitized sources are very, very valuable. But God, there's a lot of wrong stuff on there too. So when it comes to doing numismatic research, trust your primary sources, get a big library full of secondary sources and find out where they did their research. then go back and check where their primary sources were correctly interpreted or incorrectly interpreted, find out what they missed, and kind of pave your own road. And you can do it without speculation. You can let the facts speak for themselves. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share, and I guess I'll take questions. That's all I've got for you. So who's got what for me?
Alrighty, let's see. I think we've got one currently in the Q&A, and then we are ready to start that. So audience members, feel free to send more into that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. To start off with, in doing cataloging work, what is your most frequently consulted book?
The dictionary. Sometimes, so I work in my basement, and I'll come upstairs and my wife will see me looking tired and exasperated and probably hungry and cranky. And the thing that she knows I'm about to say to her is, I need words. And sometimes I just need to go and read a short story, read 10 pages of Dostoevsky, read the Bible, read the newspaper, read Sports Illustrated. Sometimes I just need more words because I feel like I'm writing the same words over and over and over again. So any place where I can get words, and the dictionary is a good place to get words, is cited every time I do my cataloging. Now, in terms of what reference I use most often, I mean, I catalog a lot of different stuff. Right now, I'm working on a collection of British campaign medals. I do tokens and medals and colonial coins. Of course, I did the Pogue catalog, which is all, federal U.S. coins. It's hard to avoid the Breen Encyclopedia if you're writing about colonials or federal coins. But the thing about Breen that I use most often is the bibliography. Because while I don't always trust Breen's interpretation of the facts, I know that he went digging and looking for them. So his bibliography is great, and it's a great place to kind of get to where he came from. So you can kind of do the end around where he was wrong or inventive, and get back to where his real facts were. And I still use Crosby an awful lot too, especially obviously for colonial coins, but Crosby still has information that has not been surpassed anywhere else.
All righty. And let's see, we have someone who wanted to share a relevant quote.
All right.
Let's see. Skepticism is the chastity of the intellect, and it is shameful to surrender it too soon or to the first comer. There is nobility in preserving it coolly and proudly through long youth, until at last, in the ripeness of instinct and discretion, it can be safely exchanged for fidelity and happiness. From George Santayana, originally. That's not the person watching, that's the person who said the quote.
That's right. Yeah. So, I mean, as a historian, you want to come to this with a passion for the subject and an enthusiasm for the subject. And that means being able to read stuff and get inside of the story and become a storyteller. But, when you're talking about sources and trying to, separate wheat from chaff and all that stuff, skepticism gets pretty important, honestly. So.
All righty. We've got multiples coming in all of a sudden.
Right.
Do you subscribe to Anu Garg's A Word a Day? It's a great source for words not frequently encountered.
I don't. I get so many emails and I can't possibly tolerate another email. Mm-hmm. So let's see. Do I refer to Mossman's Crime and Punishment a lot? I do, and it's a great book. It's very, very well done. And again, it was an approach with the same style as the other Mossman book that we talked about here, that he went in for the original research. He went in and did the primary source research that in some cases surpassed Scott, and didn't fall down that rabbit hole of speculation or having a story in mind and then finding the facts to support it. He went and found the facts and let them speak for themselves. Mm-hmm. So.
Alrighty, what is the best website for original documents in the numismatic field?
Well, I mean, the Newman portal obviously has a lot of documents, but there's a lot that's not there as well. So, I mean, I find myself going to a lot of college library websites, a lot of municipal library websites. There are specialized repositories. I use newspaper databases extensively. Newspapers can be a problematic source, as anyone who actually reads newspapers today full well understands. But there's really not one-stop shopping. This kind of research would be a lot easier and a lot quicker if there was one-stop shopping, unfortunately. So, all right, what do I think about Dave Bauer's books?
Yep.
Well, so Dave has done a lot of digging. Dave's favorite kind of research tends to be older secondary sources. Like he loves Harper's Weekly, for instance. And Dave has a great contextual knowledge and a great basis in history, where he's able to put a lot of things in their interesting historical and political context. I don't think Dave has spent a lot of time in, dusty repositories. Although that being said, he's always hired a lot of researchers to go through particularly numismatic primary sources, and has always been a collector of manuscripts and documents on his own, particularly when he's delving into a particular specialty era. So Dave's books, Dave is a storyteller at heart. So Dave tells a great story with a lot of good historical facts kind of wrapped into it. But ultimately, I don't think Dave is going for the level of historical precision, which isn't to say his books are inaccurate, but he's not a Mossman or a Kenneth Scott kind of academician when it comes to history. So Scott, they're all the same. They're reprints. So so the 1957 edition hasn't been improved upon or changed, but you can get the earlier monographs that the 1957 edition is based upon, like Counterfeiting Colonial Pennsylvania, Counterfeiting Colonial New York, et cetera, et cetera.
Alrighty, that is the last one we have for right now. We're going to stick around for another minute or two. So if you have any questions, get those in quickly. Otherwise, so this entire thing has been recorded and it will be up on the NNP about 2 weeks from Sunday. So if you missed the beginning or want to share it with a friend, all of the recordings will be there, and you'll be getting an email when those go up, as well as announcements on our social media and website. So those should be widely advertised. And let's see. All right, we have another question. Is there one person you wish would have published their research for whom it is now too late?
Oh, there's a few. Damon Douglas is one. Damon Douglas was a spectacular researcher, really understood the value of primary sources, and had a great broad continuum of historical knowledge to properly contextualize primary source work. He didn't write a whole lot. And I think part of it was he kind of got fed up with the coin industry as opposed to, numismatic research, and realized that no matter what he published about this, that, or the other thing, coin dealers would still say what coin dealers did, which, trust me, I get it. Damon Douglas would be first on that list. Another guy is Edgar Adams. Edgar Adams wrote a few books. He wrote some articles, but he was really good and really careful about what he published, about what he said. And if Edgar Adams had written 10 more books, they all would have been spectacular. So Len says, is that my entire library behind me? No, of course not. That's a lot of it, but no, man, there's books everywhere. Come on.
All right, and there have been quite a few comments coming into the Q&A thanking you for an exceptional and very well researched and thought out presentation. So I want to make you aware of those.
All right, thank you much. Thank you all for attending. I appreciate your company.
All righty, yes, thank you so much for taking the time to join us for a second time, I believe. We always love having you back, and thank you everyone. Nope, we're not done. There are more questions coming in.
All right, Pierre, what if you get asked about the origin of something where there might have been no original sources found, but hints of things that might explain them, and numerous theories, and perhaps one is plausible but not based on direct fact? I mean, here's the thing. Obviously, with speculation exists because in some ways it's valuable, right? We have inquiring minds. When we find something that we don't understand, we want to explain it. That's sort of the nature of science, and that's, and many times the nature of historical inquiry as well. I think it's fine as long as it's couched as what it is. There are certainly objects in the realm of numismatics that don't have any source material at all. We don't know anything about them other than the fact that they exist. And many times, if you look in a sort of standard catalog kind of reference, you look in a book and it's like, okay, I'm going to research everything I can about this. And all you find in all of these books is that the thing exists. So then you have to use all of this broad historical context and historical knowledge to try to figure out what that object is telling you, divorced and independent of any other kind of knowledge. And in some cases, we just have to throw up our hands and say, we'll never know. Here's my opinion. It would be great if we could say everything about everything. Oh, he's talking about fantasy Confederate thing. All right, that sounds like a conversation for another day. But for a lot of stuff, there's just no paper trail left behind. And so then you just kind of have to take them for what they're worth and see if they make most sense, fit in one place versus another place, and understand that no amount of historical shoehorning is ever going to create a narrative where the data doesn't lead you, where there just isn't one that exists currently. Mm-hmm. So,
all right. What do you think of John Ford as a researcher?
I think John Ford wasn't a researcher. I think John Ford was a very smart guy and a very clever merchant, and had a broad base of historical knowledge. I don't know that John Ford ever went into a library and sat down with a stack of papers and flipped through them until he was sneezing and tried to figure out what was valuable in there that no one else had ever seen before. So I think that while he was a very knowledgeable guy and a very smart guy, I don't think he was a researcher per se. Now, one thing that Ford was good at, because he had so much knowledge with the actual objects and so much experience putting hands on objects, and that's part and parcel of this. All of these people that wrote all these books, they handled a lot of coins. There's only so much you can do from a book, from documents. If you don't have the experience looking at coin after coin after coin after coin, it's really hard to have an opinion about a coin, because sometimes the documents might tell you one thing, that you got the object in your hand and it just tells you something else. And so that's important. But John Ford knew a lot about the objects because he'd handled all of them. So he was able to kind of describe the objects in, I think, a useful and valuable way without actually putting the nuts and bolts of historical research behind it. Mm-hmm. So works that are primarily speculative and not evidence-based. There's a lot of them. Most numismatic research is speculative and not evidence-based. And which is not to say it's all wrong, but it's to say that most secondary works depend upon other secondary works. And that's not evidence-based. It's synthetic rather than analytical. You know, are there books that completely make stuff up? Absolutely. Lots and lots of them. And I try to avoid them when I can. So is anyone doing an update of the Betts book? I believe someone is working on an update of the Betts book. The Betts book is sort of interesting insofar as every metal that's in there was taken from an initial document. So it wasn't just things that he saw and said, there's nothing in here, we don't know anything about it, it just exists. But there was some documentary hook to it, which means there's things in there that don't exist because they only exist in documents and maybe were never produced or are unknown or whatever else. I believe the Betts book is being redone. I have no idea when to expect that, or if it's going to be a listing kind of catalog or a historical catalog, or, you know, the Betts realm is so broad that you could go a lot of different directions with a redo of Betts. My opinion of continental dollars, my opinion is that they are not currency, that they are metals, and that's where every bit of the actual data and evidence points. I am not going to name names. Chris McDowell's working on a Betts update. There you go. And another question about the continental dollar. Yeah, I think they're metals. So there you go.
All right, sped through that Q&A. Yep. All righty. If anyone has anything else, get it in quickly. Let me clear this out. There we go. Okay. I don't want to cut off anyone's questions here, so I'm going to give our little wrap-up spiel again. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. We'll start again tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern. I believe we're starting off tomorrow with Chris McDowell and Dennis Hengeveld, whose last name I'm not sure how to pronounce yet. So be sure to tune in for some of those, and I look forward to seeing some of your names pop back up in the attendance list for future presentations. And one last time, thank you, John, for taking the time out to join us.
Happy to do it. Thanks, y'all.
Bye.